Okay, yeah, I've been studying bullying for 2 decades, so I love when I'm asked to talk about it for 15 minutes. So I had to make some decisions about what to prioritize, and we're going to shift gears here a little bit, and we're not going to talk about neuroscience. We're going to talk about middle school kids, early adolescence through late adolescence, and we're going to talk about perpetration, so those kids that engage in these types of behaviors. And I also want to talk about some of Sherry Hamby's recent work of really kind of arguing that we need to look at the intersections between different types of violence, right? This is a bullying conference, and certainly we're talking about bullying, but bullying is not isolated, that it co-occurs with other things. I would not be able to do this and present this longitudinal work if it were not for the support of Centers for Disease Control and National Institutes of Justice that don't necessarily, these are not their findings and conclusions, it's all me, but allows the opportunity for us to go in and really do some serious longitudinal analysis of understanding this overlap. So what we're going to do in the very short time is to think about some potential predictors of bullying involvement, but then not stop there and think about how bullying involvement in early adolescence actually leads to different types of violence as kids' relationships become nuanced in different ways. And certainly there's a body of literature that argues that family context matters as we think about bullying perpetration, that coercive exchanges between parents and children in the home often co-occur with abusive and conflictual family dynamics, which have been linked to bullying perpetration. Remarkably, when we look at just outside of the aggression literature and look to the unique aspects of bullying, of the repetition and the power dynamic, there's very few studies that have looked at that link to see if there's a differentiation. But certainly the studies that are there suggest that there's direct and indirect exposure to family violence, and domestic violence is linked to bullying perpetration. Also, what I'm going to try to do here is increasingly in our studies, we were starting to see high rates of sexual harassment being linked to bullying and high rates of what we call homophobic name calling. So this came through our quantitative studies, but also our qualitative studies, that by 6th and 7th grade, they weren't putting that necessarily fag in the yearbook, but certainly that's a very common occurrence. It takes about 3 minutes when you go into the middle school to hear this kind of language. And so my colleagues at the Centers for Disease Control proposed what we call the bully sexual violence link theory, in that bullying perpetration was predictive of sexual violence over adolescence and share similar risk factors. Miller and colleagues more recently demonstrated the remarkable co-occurrence of bullying and dating violence and also sexual harassment. However, there's limited number of longitudinal studies that unpack this mechanism from contextual variables to bullying perpetration and extend this on into later adolescence. There's even fewer longitudinal studies that consider how bullying perpetration is associated with the emergence of gender-based bullying, sexual harassment, and teen dating violence during early adolescence. So what we did in this 5.5-year study of tracking students is that we wanted to build on a model that proposed that child abuse and domestic violence would be associated with family conflict, associated with the onset of bullying perpetration, but then would be associated as kids transition from middle to high school to sexual harassment perpetration. And then finally, as kids begin to becoming involved in romantic relationships, the extent to which this perpetration would escalate into the teen dating violence relationship. And so between 2008 and 2013, we tracked approximately 1,162 students, and the cohorts were 5th, 6th, and 7th grades in the 2008. And we're currently actually this morning surveying some of these kids. But prior to today, there were 7 waves of data collections, including both self-report, peer report, and friendship nominations. And so there's a series of research hypotheses you can imagine after a 5.5-year study, but specifically what I want to focus on today is that we wanted to establish, beyond anecdotes, beyond observations of what we were hearing in the schools across the country, that actually bullying perpetration, that verbal, relational, repeated forms of bullying perpetration would actually escalate and longitudinally to this homophobic language that we were hearing. It was very, very important for us to show quantitatively that there was a causal link, because teachers and administrators are quite dismissive and think this language is quite benign. Then we wanted to show that in fact there's a socialization process. If in fact bullying escalates to homophobic name calling, and we know from the work of Nan Stein and Michael Kimmel that in fact if there's a heteronormativity, if there's this language that's creating a hostile environment, then we know that boys and girls may try to demonstrate their heterosexuality by sexually harassing others. And so we wanted to show that link. And then, of course, into the high school study, we suspected if in fact bullying and homophobic name-calling promotes these kind of unhealthy relationships, we suspect that they would take those unhealthy strategies into dating relationships. And so to answer that first research question, with the help of a wonderful statistician, Todd Little, we were able to show very nicely with a good fit this longitudinal model that shows that, in fact, as kids across a 2.5-year period from 5th to 7th grade, if they engage in high rates of bullying perpetration, and those are the top circles there, then in fact it does escalate to them using the homophobic language in our schools. And this has been very, very powerful when I'm working with teachers and administrators. A lot of teachers will say, I hear this language, and we can simply show this and encourage teachers and administrators to just say we don't use that language here. It's very, very important. But we wanted to extend this kind of causal model into other forms of violence, which I'll get to. But in our other studies, we found that homophobic name-calling is quite prevalent in the middle schools. Youth who engage in what we call garden variety, verbal and relational forms of bullying actually do escalate to homophobic name-calling. This is very, very important because most of our programs do not address this type of language. If I can simply get teachers in the United States to say we don't use that word, like we don't use the R word to refer to students with disabilities, or racial epithets in our schools, it would be a major accomplishment. And so we need to think about the discussion of the language that even teachers use and administrators use that marginalize gender nonconforming and lesbian and gay and bisexual and transgendered youth. And I'm in the field trying to do that in a randomized clinical trial, and there's extreme backlash with even talking to kids about this language because the folks that I work with actually see this as an agenda of promoting an alternative sexual orientation. So because I understand the political climate that I work in, and we all should understand this, I then also make an argument that it's not simply about sexual orientation. It can be gender nonconforming. It's actually denigration of girls and women in our schools. And so then we demonstrate that bullying perpetration and homophobic name-calling perpetration is actually associated 2.5 years later with sexual harassment perpetration, right? So we can see the socialization process that bullying is escalating to this homophobic name-calling, and kids in reaction to that demonstrate that their heterosexuality. Now these kids are into high school, and certainly if increasingly folks are talking about bullying perpetration as social interactions and social dynamics that are influenced and maintained by schools, peers, and families. But there's very few studies that have extended that model into teen dating violence, and in reality, many of them are cross-sectional, so we don't have a good picture of what is happening from middle school to high school, especially with good measurement around teen dating violence perpetration. Oftentimes our studies are single-item indicators, and most of the national data actually just include victimization items. So in this work, our research is really predicated on a social ecological model and a social interactional learning model in which family violence serves as an important context for understanding the relation between bullying perpetration and involvement and delinquency as predictors of sexual harassment and teen dating violence. So we test this ecologically driven model, evaluating the changing influence of key socialization agents across early to late adolescence, but also look at some potential antecedents. And this is somewhat of a trimmed model. We have in this data set about 32 risk and protective factors, so you will see that my students and I will continue to kind of unpack this complex mechanisms. For the girls, and we separated girls out just because there's a tremendous amount of variability in the ways in which they report bullying perpetration, even exposure to family conflict and sibling aggression. And there's usually, this model is very expansive in lots of circles, so I've put the latent constructs here so you get some idea. For girls, the family context in early middle school, family conflict and sibling aggression. And if you follow the bullying literature at all, you know that sibling aggression is emerging as quite a potent predictor of bullying involvement, both on perpetration and the victimization side. So this confirms that across time that predicts bullying perpetration. And as students transition to high school, we see a connection, a very strong link to sexual harassment perpetration. Remembering that even in middle and high school, and even in high school, a lot of the sexual harassment perpetration is unwanted sexual commentary and sexual rumors, and then also we have middle and high school students that don't understand their kind of body boundaries, right? So there will be some tugging, but we're not talking necessarily about sexual assault or rape, although there's more recent research showing that may actually be a connection as well, and we'll find out as we continue to track these kids. And certainly we found that sexual harassment perpetration, that unwanted sexual commentary, the unwanted touching was predicted teen dating violence perpetration, and that in the form of both physical, sexual coercion, and verbal. So the model fit for the girls very nicely. The boys' model also fit nicely, except that family conflict did not predict bullying perpetration, just sibling aggression. Again, sibling aggression, which many of us feel is a proxy in some ways for violence in the home, was an important predictor here as well. Let's not underestimate this model. I mean, this was a 5.5-year study where we were able to track the kids through, and starting early. I mean, a lot of this work is not done with young kids looking at kind of these kind of variables. So, what are some recommendations? So, research must consider multiple contexts to understand both the mediators and moderators associated with those kids that engage in these behaviors. We must begin to think much more creatively about incorporating discussions of gender-based name-calling, sexual violence, and gender expression. I often ask teachers if they do gender in the classroom, and they say, I have boys and girls in the classroom. So, certainly, they don't know how to have this conversations. What is very, very encouraging, we just finished a randomized clinical trial last year funded by the Centers for Disease Control, and we found that after 3 years of a social-emotional learning program in which kids learned empathy, perspective taking, diversity, we had a narrator in the curriculum that was clearly gender nonconforming, and that invoked conversations with kids where teachers had to talk about that. We had 50% reductions in homophobic name-calling and sexual harassment perpetration after 2 years. That's pretty powerful, right? So this was a program that didn't necessarily talk directly about that, but created a safe space for kids to talk about how their language may be hurtful if directed towards someone that identifies as LGBT or as gender nonconforming. We are also following up with that study because we know it's not enough. Another study funded by the Centers for Disease Control to do what we call gender-enhanced social-emotional learning. And this is where everyone will get in the trial a social-emotional learning curriculum, but then we're going to, in one arm of that RCT, we're going to do extensive professional development with the teachers to understand how their language and may be biasing certain subgroups in the schools, but at the same time creating a safe space for them to learn how to talk about gender in the classroom. So we're getting there, slowly but surely, but you should know that not all society is ready to have these conversations with middle school kids. We have to think about both secondary and tertiary types of program to address those kids that are exposed to family violence. We must address what is really coming out in our high school sample. Remember, bullying, predicting teen dating violence, victimization, and perpetration, multiple forms. And surprisingly, with that link to bullying and sexual coercion within the dating relationships, it was remarkable how many girls reported this, so we certainly need to think about following that up. So those kids that are involved in bullying, it's a huge literature. There's lots of cross-sectional data. What we really need is comprehensive, socio-ecologically driven longitudinal studies so that we can understand the different trajectories as we go forward. This is somewhat concerning because if we just focus on bullying prevention and do not understand how we need to complement these studies as kids go into more nuanced relationships, we will continue to get the low effect sizes. We need to be developmentally sensitive to the types of experiences kids are reporting. And I'll end with a meta-analysis that David Yeager and his team at Texas did, which hopefully you will see soon. And this showed that the effect size for bullying prevention programs go down to 0 in 8th grade, and they're negative in high school. So we actually have heterogenic effects of what we're doing in high school. And that's largely because we're putting programs that are designed for K through 5 into high schools, right? So this would be the OES program that has limited evidence in the United States. It may not be developmentally appropriate for high school, and also may include positive behavior intervention supports that may not be developmentally sensitive. Anybody that works with kids, you know by 8th grade, the last thing they want to do is to do anything we ask them to do, right? So we have to think about and learn from public health and learn from prevention science of what types of messages do high schoolers want to hear from us. Thank you.
Thank you, Dorothy. Our final presentation for the panel will be by Robert Ferris, who's going to take us back to that macro level again, much more thinking about the social context and peer network. So we're excited to have a sociologist here to make us think a little bit differently about some of the connections between youth. Thanks.
Oh, good.